Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we explore a unique perspective on what's going on in the current carnage in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas, you'll all recall that on Saturday, October 7th, Hamas launched a devastating attack on Israel that claimed the lives and casualties of well over 1,000 people. And now the Israelis are massing on the border of northern Gaza, have ordered the evacuation of over 1.1 million Gazans, and have been firebombing and strafing large parts of Gaza as people are fleeing to the south. I was interested that on Friday, just a few days ago, the U.S. State Department issued a memo to all U.S. diplomats around the world, saying that in reference to what the Israelis are now about to do to Gaza, no one was permitted to talk about de-escalation or a ceasefire or an end to the violence or bloodshed, that the only posture of the U.S. government is to support an escalation of the war. Today, it was announced that President Biden, at the invitation of Prime Minister Netanyahu, might be going to Israel to show his unreserved solidarity for what the Israelis are going to now do to Gaza. It's an extraordinary moment in contemporary history. We have been monitoring it, as you all know, and will continue to do that. And today, we want to hear from several people of Jewish ancestry about their perspective on what is happening, because the call for more war and a prohibition on the part of the State Department against anybody in an official capacity talking about a ceasefire or an end to violence or an end to the bloodshed is certainly what we're being told across the news media and in the prevailing mainstream media, for sure, in North America and in Europe. But there are other perspectives. We want to start today with a short 10-minute video that was released over the weekend by Dr. Gabor Maté. Gabor Maté, as you probably all know, is a world-famous psychiatrist. He was born in Hungary. He'll tell a little bit about his story, and has become probably the world's leading specialist on trauma and how transgenerational trauma can affect people for many, many generations. So he's speaking out as a Jew on these matters with a perspective that, as soon as I heard it, I knew it was very important for all of us at Humanity Rising to listen to. And then when he's finished, I'll introduce our other speaker for today, who will speak for the balance of the time. But let's start, everyone, with a video of Gabor Maté on what's happening right now in Palestine. You'll note that at the beginning, there's a little bit of a background scratchiness. It wasn't professionally done. He was just in the process of an interview, but it doesn't last very long. And what he is saying is well worth watching. So thank you, everyone. Welcome to Humanity Rising. Here's the video.
This is one of the issues that's closest to my heart, and it has been for a long time. So, you know my history, I don't have to repeat it, but I'm personally a Holocaust survivor as an infant. I barely survived. My grandparents were killed in Auschwitz, and most of my extended family was killed. That's my personal background. I grew up ashamed of my Jewishness. In Hungary, after the war, I was still bullied for being Jewish. And I remember one of my friends coming to my rescue once saying, "Leave him alone, it's not his fault that he's Jewish." It's a fault, but it's not his fault. This was the defense. So I grew up with that. In my teenage years in Canada, I became a Zionist. This dream of the Jewish people resurrected in their historical homeland, and the barbed wire of Auschwitz being replaced by the boundaries of a Jewish state with a powerful army. I found it liberating. It was exhilarating to believe in that dream. And I absorbed all that perspective and all that point of view, and I really believed in it. And then I found out that it wasn't exactly like that. That in order to make this Jewish dream a reality, we had to visit a nightmare on the local population. You couldn't, there was a Zionist slogan called a land without a people for a people without a land. But there was no there was no land without a people. There was people living there who'd been living there for hundreds and years or even longer. As a matter of fact, if you want to hear something really interesting, and David Ben-Gurion, who was the first Prime Minister of Israel, actually subscribed to this. He said this, who are the Palestinians? Because the Jews in Roman times, all of them never left Palestine. Many of them stayed there. And some of them, hundreds of years later, converted to Islam. So guess who the Palestinians are? In some ways, they might be descendants of ancient Jews. They are cousins, to say the least, no matter how you look at it. And you know, and there's no way you could have ever created a Jewish state without oppressing and expelling the local population, which is what they did in 1947, beginning in 1947, and first of all with British Empire protection, you know, but they did this, and then in 1948, Jewish Israeli historians, have shown without a doubt that the expulsion of the Palestinians was persistent, it was pervasive, it was cruel, it was murderous, and with deliberate attempt. So that's what's called the Nakba in Arabic, the disaster or the catastrophe. Now in Canada, there's a law that you cannot deny the Holocaust. I don't believe in such laws, by the way. But in Israel, you're not allowed to mention the Nakba, even though it was at the very basis of the foundation of the state. So once I became aware of all this, I was, okay, well, yeah, we created this beautiful dream, but we imposed a nightmare on somebody else. And then I visited the occupied territories, Russell, during the first Intifada. I cried every day for 2 weeks at what I saw. The brutality of the occupation, the petty harassment, the murderousness of it, the burning down of Palestinian or cutting down of Palestinian olive groves, the denial of water rights, the humiliations. And this went on, and it's much worse now than it was then. So this is the background. And it couldn't have been in any other way. Because again, you couldn't have created that exclusive Jewish state without oppressing or expelling the local population. It's the longest ethnic cleansing operation in the 20th and 21st centuries. It's still going on. And who are these people in Gaza? Now you have to go to Gaza. You have to go there to really appreciate it. It's a small area where there are these multiple hundreds of thousands of people. Who are those people? The direct children or grandchildren of the people that were expelled from Israel, or what is now Israel. Now here's the outrage. And I'd like your Zionist friend in the States to tell me this. I, as a Jew, I could land in Tel Aviv tomorrow and demand citizenship under the law of the right of return. But my Palestinian friend in Vancouver, Hana Kawas, who was born in Jerusalem, can't even visit. So what sense does it now? So who is Gaza? This desperate, blockaded. Let me stop again. Am I talking too long about this? I'm sorry. This is so important to me, and I know so much about it that I don't even know where to stop. So then you have these miserable people packed into this horrible, people call it the world's largest outdoor prison, which is what it is. Incredible poverty, 50% unemployment. Now Hamas is an Islamic organization that was originally encouraged by Israel and supported by Israel as a counterweight to the secular Palestine Liberation Organization, which Israel didn't want to deal with. And given those conditions, of course people will go for extremist leadership. That's what people do when they're miserable and hopeless and deprived of any possibility whatsoever. You don't have to support Hamas policies to stand up for Palestinian rights. That's a complete falsity. But there were free elections in Gaza, monitored by international community. They were declared to be the freest elections ever held in the Arab world. And Hamas happened to win. And when Hamas won that election, Israel and the United States immediately organized a military coup against them, which Hamas defeated, for which the punishment was this blockade that deprives Hamas of, not Hamas, but Gaza, of food, of medical supplies, of sufficient water. I could go on and on and on and on. And then you have this conflict. And then every time there's a conflict, Israel mows the lawn. That's the expression they use. You know what they call it? They call it mowing the lawn, by which they mean the mass murder of Palestinian civilians. Now, is it true that the Gazans shoot rockets into Israel, killing innocent civilians? Yes, it is. Do I support that? No, I don't. But when it comes to the death of innocent civilians, Israel killed 20,000 Lebanese civilians in 1982, using illegal weapons like cluster bombs, in a war that had no justification whatsoever. I could go on and on and on and on, except I'll say that the disproportion of power and responsibility and oppression is so markedly on one side that if you take the worst thing you can say about Hamas, multiplied by 1,000 times, and it still will not meet the Israeli repression and killing and dispossession of Palestinians. If after 2,000 years we can look for liberation and freedom, why can't the Palestinians? If you look at the Western press, when Hong Kong demonstrators throw stones at the police in Hong Kong, that's considered to be heroism in the American press. When in Myanmar, the demonstrators throw slingshots at the army, at the oppressive army, they're considered to be heroes in the Western press. When Palestinian kids throw stones at the Israeli soldiers, they're called terrorists. And Israel gets away with a lot more without much less criticism in the Western press than any other country. I'll say one more thing. I was recently contacted by a Palestinian woman from Jericho. She runs a program for Palestinian children who spend time in Israeli jails. 14, 15, 16-year-olds are jailed for months or years. Sometimes they can't see their families for months. And she runs a program for them. You know what she does? She meditates with them. She does Sufi dervish dancing with them, swirling, dancing. to bring them out of their stress state. She says, we don't have post-traumatic stress disorder here because the trauma is never post. The trauma is daily, she said. I just wish your Zionist friend would visit the occupied territories in Gaza like I have, and let him speak the way he speaks now. If he's got any ounce of humanity left, he would cry like I did for 2 weeks when I was there. Now, we're not living in Nazi Germany. Anybody can go on YouTube and listen to Ilan Pappé, an Israeli historian, totally eloquent on Israeli history, who's living in England now because life became in Israel too difficult for him. Anybody can listen to Norman Finkelstein, a Jewish professor, world expert on Gaza, who was denied tenure at his university because of his public speaking against Israeli policy. You can listen to any number of Israeli Defense Forces soldiers who talk about the brutality that they now regret having committed. You can listen to Israeli pilots who talk about why they refuse to fly over Gaza because of the atrocities they're made to commit. You can get all the information you want. So if anybody these days doesn't know, it's not because the information is not available. It's not what you know, it's what you could know if you wanted to find out. There are no two sides. I mean, it's always a complex question, but in terms of power and control, and it's pretty straightforward. There was a land with the people living there, and other people wanted it. They took it over, and they continue to take it over, and they continue to discriminate against, oppress, and dispossess that other people. That's what happened, and that's what's happening. Thank you for watching. You can get my book.
Thank you, everyone. That was a very powerful statement by Gabor Maté. I want to now bring in Dov Korff-Korn, who's an attorney with the Romero Institute. He works with the Lakota People's Law Project. He's a graduate of Dartmouth College, where he majored in Middle Eastern studies and also Indigenous affairs. He spent a lot of time in Israel and Palestine. I heard him recently speak about these issues, as all of us are, as we're trying to absorb the enormity of what's going on. We're trying to understand the layers and the nuances of what's going on. So I invited Dov on rather short notice to join us. And so, Dov, I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising, and just welcome you to say anything that you would like to say as a comment on what Gabor Maté just said, and then tell us a little bit more about your own history and how you evolved, like Gabor did, to a deeper and more complex understanding of what's going on in that part of the world.
Thanks, Jim, for having me for your comments. Hello to everybody. I don't know where everyone else is in the world, but I'm in northern New Mexico on Pueblo lands in a beautiful place, one of my favorite places in the world. It's the only place I can live that is landlocked, but maybe because it used to be an ocean back in prehistoric days. Yeah, just, my first comment off of Gabor's talk there is how he finished, and we're living in a time, and we could blame Trump's presidency for this. We could blame polarization for this, but we're living in a time where, for some reason, facts don't really matter, and people's opinions seem to take precedence over everything else. And so, with this conflict, especially, we're seeing people of all stripes and political perspectives sharing their opinions as if they know what they're talking about. And a lot of people have no idea what they're talking about. Even people that have studied this conflict for their entire lives still don't know everything. But there are facts and there are truths, and those are the things that are easily lost when we discuss these issues. But there's one fact I'll start with, and that there's an oppressor in this equation and there's an oppressed in this equation. I think what happens from the Israeli side of things is the equating of oppressing with aggressing. And there's no doubt that over the last 80 years in their resistance against the Israeli state, Palestinians have turned to aggression, right? I mean, aggression is a very common response when people are placed under pressure, but being an aggressor is much different than being an oppressor. When you're an oppressor, you control, subjugate, dominate over people, you restrict their freedoms, their agency, in the name of your own political, military, sovereignty, whatever the words are. But the way Israel has framed it over the last several decades is they've almost won this PR campaign. They've been able to frame Palestinians and any resistance to Israeli military rule and occupation. They've been able to frame that as just another iteration of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And that's incredibly dangerous because there are many Jews in the world today who, including myself and my family, that the one that I come from, that made a conscious choice to not go to Palestine. And maybe not purely for an understanding of what was to come, but because in a lot of Jewish tradition, there is an aversion to returning to that land until there's a peaceful time on earth. In the Hasidic tradition, which is where I come from, we don't believe you can have a reincarnation of the Jewish kingdom, because there was the Jews have a long history there. We're not supposed to have a reincarnation of our government or peoplehood in that land until there's peace on earth. And there's no question that Israel was founded in a time not just of war, but incredible suffering, not just for Jewish people, but for other groups. I mean, in the wake of World War II, heightened neocolonialism, there's just massive suffering going on in the 40s in the internment camps, Native people in boarding schools. And so I just want to start there. And that's to say that we are duped into thinking, even if all of us in this room right now, have an inclination towards supporting the liberation of Palestinian people, we still have been force-fed often from, especially the American media, that the Palestinians they want Israel off the map. And it's not just because they've faced violence from the Israeli military, but because at some point along the way, they took on what Hitler wanted to finish. And that is an incredible it's inaccurate, but it's unjust to frame a valid resistance. And obviously there's certain aspects of the Palestinian resistance that are incredibly wrong, killing civilians, indiscriminate targeting civilians. Hamas is not just a terror group, but they rule Gaza with an iron fist. They don't care for the reproductive rights of women. They don't care for teaching secular knowledge. They're a militaristic, violent group run by men who gain their power from the guns they hold in their hands. But that's not to say that Hamas speaks for Palestine or Palestinians. And I just wanted to start there by saying that there are facts on the ground. There is a power dynamic that is unmistakably slanted towards Israel. And there's a lot of factors at play that we can get into, but I just want to be clear that there are facts and there are truths. And I'm frankly sad and tired of seeing people who don't have much of a connection to this issue speaking louder than, not just they should, but louder than people who are better positioned to speak.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dov. Why don't we just move to your own biography and tell us a little bit more the situation, in which you grew up, what you were taught, and like Gabor Maté, how you kind of worked your way through to a more nuanced and dimensionalized understanding of what was going on.
Of course, yeah, thanks, Jim. They say this in any organizing or activist space I've ever been in. They say you have to speak from yourself, your personal experience, use I statements. It sounds kind of cliche, but it's true. I mean, I remember the last time I heard that when I was a kid. I was in nursery school, and you're supposed to speak, you're not supposed to tell other people what they're supposed to think. You're supposed to speak for yourself. But the same is true here. I was raised in a Zionist religious Jewish community in New York City, in Manhattan. Fortunately, I didn't really have any family in Israel. I think I had a distant cousin. I have family that has since moved there, but I didn't have any family. And so I didn't grow up going there. I didn't grow up, I was saturated in Zionism, but I didn't know that I was, because my parents never really made an effort to take us there. They didn't, expect us to ever live there. And I had friends whose families would go travel there twice a year. Their kids would join the military, the Israeli army. They had lots of family in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, and so I think one of the greatest privileges I've had is that I was not. I was maybe saturated enough in Zionism, but I wasn't completely inculcated with it. I remember the first time this stuff came on my mind, I was in sixth grade. And there had been for a few years, a couple of soldiers were abducted by Hamas and kept in Gaza, and the entire Jewish community of the U.S. practically was mobilized to stop this. And I remember, and to return those soldiers. And I remember that there wasn't this level of infighting back then. There was infighting, there was disagreement among the Jewish community, but there wasn't much disagreement about the need to return these soldiers. And these are like 18-year-old men who were, abducted and abused. And but then I remember there was the Iran question, and I remember my dad, who's far to the right of me. I love him, but we don't agree most of the time. But he kept saying, Israel is the enemy of the Arab world. Israel is our homeland. You're young, but you don't understand that he was born in the 40s. You don't understand, the precarious position the Jewish people have been in, and we need a state. We need a military outpost. We need a place that secures our interests. And I remember the way it was framed is it's either Iran's sovereignty or Israeli sovereignty. And that launched me into, that was in middle school. And then I got to high school, and now I was in an even more stridently Zionist space. I went to a Jewish high school. I learned Hebrew, studied Torah, did all the things. Many of my classmates, if they weren't Israeli, had plenty of family there. As I said, they would travel there. And I remember feeling confused because the only available paths for engagement around this issue was AIPAC. I don't know if anyone knows about AIPAC, but AIPAC is it's like the NRA, but for Israel. It's the Israeli lobby, or the Zionist lobby. And today, unfortunately, Zionist has, like the word Jew has some negative ring to it, but Zionist is not a dirty word. It's just, it's an ideology, it's a member of the ideology, the way a Jew is a Jew. I mean, these are not dirty words, but even today, people police language. But AIPAC is the Zionist lobby. Its goal is to shore up support in Congress for Israel and military aid, and not just those things, but which kind of seem neutral on their face, but also a committed anti-Palestinian stance. The AIPAC isn't concerned with the two-state solution. Maybe at a point they're concerned with American unyielding, unbridled support for the Israeli state. And I remember I went to an AIPAC conference in my freshman year of high school, and just felt completely confused at how, because I knew a little bit. I knew that there were things called settlements. I knew that there was a history of Israeli-led violence against Palestinians. I understood that it wasn't just Palestinians attacking Israel, but I was raised in a community that was not just pretty Islamophobic and Arab-phobic, but just genuinely believed that, Palestinians were always wrong and Israelis were always right. And, when you're younger and things are framed in a simple perspective like that, it's easy to be gullible. But as you get older, the world starts to maybe not become more complicated. It's already been complicated, but you start to get a sense of those complexities. And I realized soon on into high school that something was wrong. And the fact that I had rabbis teaching me who prided themselves on justice and kindness and righteousness, but for some reason the buck stopped with Palestinians, and all of a sudden their rhetoric of kindness and justice and righteousness would just fly out the window talking about Palestinian people. It didn't make sense. And the other part of it too is that the Holocaust was always used as a justification for not just Israel's existence, but Israel's right to do whatever it wants in the name of Judaism. And, you know, I'm the grandson of pogrom survivors. I don't know how many family members that died in the Holocaust. And I was raised with a commitment to justice, even though I was still surrounded by Zionism and often right-wing politics. I was raised to treat people with dignity and with compassion, and not just people, but plants and animals. And this all clashed with that perspective. And I think, you know, I could flash forward, but in high school, I helped create this political forum in my high school, because we realized that on so many issues, including Israel and Palestine, there was just, you know, not much open-minded perspective that we had access to. So myself and a few other classmates started this political forum, and it existed for a couple of years. We probably spent half of our time focused on these issues and other time on American issues. But we invited this Israeli, or this Jewish liberal Zionist at the time. Now he probably wouldn't even call himself a Zionist, but if you've seen the news recently, his name is Peter Beinart, and he's been all over the news. He's pretty much an expert and academic on the geopolitics in the region, and we invited him to speak to our school, and he came and spoke, and it wasn't received well by a lot of our classmates, because he was just perceived as too liberal, even though he was a Zionist, which is just the irony. And after he finished speaking, he met with the several of us who ran the group, and we asked him, well, thank you for speaking, but what do you think we need to do now? And he said, well, to be honest, you got to hear from Palestinians. Like, you can't just limit your knowledge to, you know, Jews or Israelis who might be somewhat liberal or open-minded on this issue. You need to have a Palestinian speak. And so he connected us with this professor named Rashid Khalidi, who's also been all over the news recently. And Khalidi is, you know, he's the Edward Said Professor of Middle Eastern Studies or Middle Eastern History at Columbia University. He's, you know, an acclaimed professor and scholar of Middle East studies. He's Palestinian himself. He's been around the block, you know, countless times, and is very well respected in this field, except for you know, except in the eyes of the right-wing media or Zionist you know, units. But he's had plenty of Zionist students. He's had Zionist PhD students. He's had religious Jewish PhD students. And even though there's disagreement in politics or disagreement in philosophy, he has, whenever I have met with him, he's only spoken highly of those people, and the same is true of them. But the short story is, we had him invited to my high school, and this will give you sort of like a snapshot of what I was, you know, raised in. But we invited him, and we had to get him approved. Usually we don't have to get an approval from the dean of the high school, but the framing was that he's a terrorist and he's Palestinian and he supports violence. And that was just this reflexive response. And so we had to spend 30 days proving to our dean that he wasn't a terrorist. I mean, it was such a crazy ask to prove that a professor of Middle East studies at Columbia University, who has classrooms full of Jewish students, right? But we were realizing that it doesn't matter what we think. This narrative is already set and controlled, and there's a survivalism in it. You know, the Jewish people have undergone enormous strife in our history, and you know, right now the sad irony is that the Palestinians, they're not an original enemy of the Jewish people. Like, we now run up against each other through the Israeli state and its presence and its way of acting, but you know, the same opposition to Jewish sovereignty over millennia have been, honestly, this is pretty much the same opposition to Palestinian liberation in this context outside of Israel, right? It's the West, it's Christian hegemony, it's the manipulation of ethnic or indigenous peoples on the ground, the divide and conquer mentality. I mean, the Middle East that we know today would not be what it is without the dividing and conquering of France and Britain and the United States and other powers over a century or a century and a half. But then we find ourselves stuck in that. And the sad truth is that the Jews, the Israelis that now exist, they won out. They were put in the position of power over their Palestinian neighbors. So, but I'll get to that. So the we had this professor, and he was eventually approved by our dean. The day after he was approved, I heard from a student who worked for our group, and she said, did you hear that he was uninvited? And I said, what? He was just invited yesterday. Apparently, a mother of students that attended our school, this woman named Pamela Geller, she wrote to the head of the school, who sits above the dean, and said, you can't allow this terrorist to come. And if anyone knows anything about Pamela Geller, you can look her up. She runs this hate group called the Stop Islamization of America. And she has spent her last 20 years of her life decrying, vilifying Muslim people. She organized this Draw Muhammad cartoon contest in Texas. I don't know if it was 8 or 10 years ago. 2 people were killed at the conference. Her goal has been to completely slander, demean, just shut down the humanity of Muslim people in America. And, Khalidi is not even, I think he's Christian by descent, right? So that's like the irony too, is that, but beyond the point. So I ran right into this, and I realized that I was not going to be supported, and my high school left us all out to dry. The story was picked up by the New York Times, by New York City media, by Israeli media. And we were told point blank, you cannot slander or speak truth about what's going on here. And if you do, we will sabotage your college admission plans. I was told that. And when you're told that and you haven't been admitted to college yet, and you know that your own future is linked to your ability to go to school, well, you just shut up. You realize that you really can't do much about it. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. What followed was, we were called Nazis, Judeo-Nazis by teachers and rabbis. Family members of mine don't talk to me anymore. And for me, it was like a very clear moment of separation. And I realized that I wasn't going to be able to be in this community anymore. And I was fine with that. After I graduated college, after I graduated high school, I went to the Middle East. I spent a year studying on a kibbutz, an Israeli kibbutz, right on the border with the West Bank. And I also went there to split my time on the ground with Palestinian and Israeli activists, trying to both build bridges, fight violence, fight the occupation, establish mutual history education, people truly working towards beneficial ends that today are much quieter than they've ever been, because I think hopelessness and despair has sort of taken over. I mean, that was 10 years ago. So yeah, 10 years a lot has changed. But I spent a lot of time on the ground, and I saw things that I'd never seen in my life before. I wasn't prepared at my age, I think. Now with hindsight, I think it was probably good to see for clarity and perspective. But I just saw people that I was technically related to, fellow Jews, beating Palestinians, berating them, chasing them with dogs. You go through checkpoints, and it just, there's no equation. There's just no equation. And the irony and the sad irony of this is that, and I see this a lot in Indigenous politics, is it's often oppressed people who never, ever, ever want to be oppressed again. And so they'd rather be an oppressor to others before ever letting others oppress them. And so you see similar tactics being played out, the similar types of domination, and hatred and vitriol. And, that's where we find ourselves, is the Israeli state anxious about its own stability, but more sickeningly using the history of anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism as a constant bulwark and support mechanism for its own existence, even though, not just its own existence, but as a justification for violence against Palestinians. When you step back from this and realize that there's Jews all over the world who don't link their Judaism with Israel, or don't link their Judaism with Zionism, but link their Judaism to thousands of years of philosophical, spiritual, ethical tradition that might have its roots in Israel. And there's no doubt that our people come from Israel at one point, and have maintained ties to Israel over the centuries. But that's far different than operating and maintaining a settler colonial militaristic rule over other people. And I'll just finish by saying that I spent time in college returning to that land, and it only got worse as I went back. And spent time in refugee camps and saw just such steady violence. And to be fair, Israelis live under their own stress and violence. Israelis are conscripted into the military. They encounter all sorts of trauma and miseries that are not really addressed in public. And I don't think I'll ever be in a position of comparing people's oppression and saying, or comparing people's sadness and stress and trauma. It's not about that, but you can objectively compare a power dynamic. You can compare statistically what that power dynamic looks like. You can compare historically what a power dynamic looks like, and politically. And so I think it's important to be frank about the relationship between the Israeli state and its rule over Palestinians. But that doesn't mean I'll ever diminish the suffering of Jewish people. I'll never diminish the trauma that Israelis, no matter how bad their political perspectives on this conflict are, if you have a child lost in war, you have a child killed in a rocket attack or in a bus bombing by Palestinians over the last few decades, there's no diminishing that. So I just want to say that. And I think the last thing I'll say on this is that we see now this almost like oppression Olympics, where Israel, people will allege that Israel's making up its traumas, it's concocted, or the Jewish people. I've met people who think the Jewish people don't even exist. We've just manufactured our history in the last few decades. There's a lot of misinformation and a lot of not just misinformation, but propaganda, right? And on all the sides. And I just think it's really critical to cut through all of it and be honest. And that's why history is our greatest teacher.
Yeah, beautifully put, Dov, and you're so right. You've spoken out of your own direct experience. It's not some abstract theoretical construct that you read in some book. Here you were, this little kid in high school trying to do the right thing, and then all of a sudden the complexities of the world come down on top of you like a ton of bricks and radicalize you in an immeasurable way. That happened to me, by the way, during the Vietnam War. Here I was, just kind of 18 years old. I wasn't paying much attention to much of anything. And the next thing I know, I get this letter from the U.S. Army saying that I had to go take a physical to see if I was healthy enough to go kill people in Vietnam. And I refused. And that set in motion a chain of events that radicalized me in an extraordinary way, that had I not had that experience, had you not had that experience with the professor from Columbia, your views probably would have remained moderate for a much longer period of time. So I think, the similar thing is happening right now, because the attack by Hamas was so sudden and so shocking. It was like a 9/11 event for Israel, as it's been referred to, and that's not an exact comparison, but it's an experience that has shocked everybody, and has forced everybody that's paying any attention to the news to start to think, what do I think about this? So in the few minutes that we've got remaining before you need to go, I would love to have your sense of, how are you processing what's happened on October 7th, what's about ready to happen with the Israelis, essentially ethnic cleansing northern Gaza? And what would be your comment on what's going on?
Yeah, I don't feel, I work in Indian law and tribal law and environmental issues these days. And certainly my experiences over there prepared me and primed me for the work I do now. I don't know if I have solutions. I have perspective. To start with, your comments about October 7th, I saw some post or article that highlighted the fact that, certainly Israelis have felt unsafe over history over there, but there's much of a feeling, that there was still a much greater sense of defensiveness or not defensiveness, but security. Like Israelis live in a stronger sense of security, even if there's still a lack of it, a much stronger sense of security than Palestinians in Gaza have ever known.
Of course.
And, right, and this Hamas attack ruptured that for Israel. It splintered. I mean, you know, I hate to say frame it as all negative, because the Israeli PR machine, as much as they're going to grieve civilians being killed, they couldn't have asked for a better event to happen for their own geopolitical strategy. Because for the last several decades, whenever there's been a skirmish or a conflict or a war between Israeli forces and Palestinian forces, whether that's in Gaza or in the West Bank, the whole international community has seen, and especially the last few years, as the world kind of wakes up a bit more to oppression, has seen a massive disparity in casualties, right? Usually, you know, there's 40 to 80, 100, maybe 200 Israeli soldiers and some civilians who are killed. And then Israel, in the process, kills thousands of people, civilians and combatants. It doesn't, right now I'm just speaking numbers, but Israel has a lot of trouble usually explaining to the international community why the casualties on the other side are 10 to 100, sometimes even more than the Israeli side. And now you have this attack by Hamas, which is miserable. I mean, it's an incredible atrocity to just kill civilians. I mean, I love music. I would imagine a lot of us in this Zoom room have gone to music festivals or to concerts, and those are places of peace and calm. And to have that disrupted by unimaginable violence, you know, there's no excuse for it. The tricky part is that the moment any of us tries to speak truth or acknowledge the underlying context in this situation, people say, oh, you're justifying Hamas and their violence. And that's not what I'm doing. Just the way I would never justify Israeli violence, but I understand where it comes from. I understand why Israel is in the position it's in and operates the way it does. And I understand why Palestinian resistance has evolved and taken shape into a very violent one. Well, there's elements of it where Israel purposely sidelined peaceful, nonviolent resistance leaders, including someone named Marwan Barghouti, who's a famous academic. They put these people in prison, and they realized during the intifadas back in early 2000 and the late 80s that if they didn't act quickly, they would be left with a successful peace resistance. I mean, even though American history education is lacking, you know, we're taught about Martin Luther King, but not Malcolm X, right? We're taught about Mandela, we're taught about Gandhi. You know, in this case, Israel knew that it could not be stuck responding to a peaceful resistance, because peaceful resistance usually wins hearts and minds, and not just the hearts and minds of the people resisting, but the opposition too. That's how apartheid was brought down, right? That's how Jim Crow was brought down, solidarity and allyship. And Israel would far rather have, on the left and the right of that country, Israel hasn't known a left-wing leadership in a long time, but even its left-wing leadership tends to support and be settler colonialist policies. But they understand that a violent resistance, it's much easier to keep the military machine going and to keep, you know, Israel since its inception has needed a military. The famous philosopher Hannah Arendt, who wrote The Banality of Evil, and, you know, was a German Jewish philosopher, scholar, author, literariist, whatever you want to call her. She wrote in the 40s, before Israel was founded, about this emerging split between the Jewish people of the world and the Hebrew nation in Israel. And she said that the Hebrew nation is proving that it needs a military to not just start itself, but to continue to exist. And she said that for as long as Israel exists, it's going to be powered by abject militarism and rule over, you know, military rule over millions of people, and it won't know anything else. And she said this will be the division between the Jews of the world and the Jews of Israel. And she couldn't have been more prescient, right? Like she saw the writing on the wall, and that's the pain here, is that militarism isn't the answer. And I think Israel has won the PR debate in saying that their militarism is only a response to Palestinian aggression. But the truth of it is that the bread and butter, the cake batter every day is militarism. Palestinians live under military rule, both in the West Bank and Gaza. They are military subjects. They don't have, it's not even about rights. It's that if they're ever brought into court, they are standing before a military tribunal. They They don't have basic, I mean, forget about running water in Gaza and electricity in Gaza, but you don't have freedom of movement in either of these places. And it's the daily, a lot of Palestinians and people that are aware of these issues, but we get really sad in these moments because the world wakes up when there's almost like this sex appeal of massive violence, like rockets and killings, and it's great for the news, and it's people love to share these. I personally can't stand watching the voyeuristic violence, right? There's just, I don't want to see shootings and people dying. I understand how bad it is. I've seen enough of it to not want to continue to repeat watching these problems. But what isn't talked about as much, and maybe we're seeing it talked about now, but it almost fades away after these conflicts die down for a bit, but is the day in, day out violence, the occupation, the siege, the blockade on Gaza. And that's the stuff that Palestinians are responding to. Palestinians aren't responding. It's weird. They're not necessarily responding right now to Israeli barrages of rockets. I mean, that's part of the equation. They're responding to their day in, day out living conditions and the position they've been forced into. And again, I'm not trying to deny the fact that over the last several decades, Palestinians have aggressed and resisted and thrown their own forms of violence at the Israeli state. But it doesn't mean that they're not living under the boot and they're not living in an oppressed, subjugated reality. So, as far as solutions, I mean, I don't want to bring the United States into this, but the US is a huge part of the problem. The US, when Trump was elected, the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, which, to be clear, there's two main factions that have been in control of Palestinian resistance for decades. One is Fatah and one is Hamas. And both groups used their resistances against the Israeli state over the last 40 or 50 years as an opportunity to also differentiate themselves from each other. Hamas is committed to violence. That's their belief. They think that jihad is the solution to salvation, redemption, resistance. Fatah speaks of itself in nonviolent terms. Fatah is just really corrupt. They're sort of the old hoagies of the Palestinian leadership. And they don't have much respect across Palestine. And so Hamas too, as Hamas has massive support in moments like this, because they're seen often as, even if every other day of the week, they're seen as antagonistic and detrimental to Palestinian liberation, the way they treat women, the way they focus on violence. When there's Israeli violence in return to Palestinians, Hamas is seen as a valid representative entity, because who else is going to defend Palestinian people? There's no other military group. But Fatah and Hamas are constantly at war. And when Trump was elected and Trump made it clear that he was going to support Israel full stop, even though that had been the American policy for so long, Obama had at least given some lip service to Palestinian freedom and support and all that. And Trump completely shut that down. And so what the Palestinian leadership did in the West Bank was proudly say, we're not going to work with the Americans. We don't trust them as a third party neutral arbiter, mediator in this conflict. For so long, the US was playing that role. I remember I was in northern West Bank. I was in Jenin, which is one of the strongholds of Palestinian resistance. And I was with friends at this hookah bar, and they'd been like sitting and smoking hookah for like 10 hours. And I remember the Mahmoud Abbas, the Fatah leader and Palestinian leader, the president came on the TV, and they lowered the volume when he came on because no one respects him. He's like in his mid 80s. He's been in power for God knows how long, but his speech was saying, we, the Palestinian people, don't trust America anymore. And to me, it was like, wow, that's, what a courageous statement of separation and resistance. And, but instead his own people they don't care. They don't trust his words. But the reason why I say all that is because Trump or not, Obama or Biden or Bush, the US has just been Israel's, unending sponsor. I mean, Israel receives almost $4 billion of aid every year from the United States. Most of that goes right into its military. I mentioned AIPAC earlier today. That's AIPAC's biggest operation, is to ensure American aid to Israel every year. But not only does Israel receive billions of dollars a year from America, it's receiving, I don't even know what it costs in money, but priceless amounts of technology information, weapons contracts, military contracts, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, name your military defense contracting nonprofit, for-profit, not nonprofit. I wish they were nonprofit and didn't exist. But so the point is that Israel's military and its existence is not anything without, it's unquestioned American support for Israel. And the other elephant in the room is evangelical Zionism. There's a huge movement of worldwide Zionism that's not actually Jewish, right, Jim? Like it's people who, in Judaism, even though we've been stuck into this equation, I believe in the core of the Jewish people. Right now, a lot of Jews, a lot of Israelis are operating out of their own fear, their own trauma. But in my hopeful world, if we're able to put that past ourselves, we can reach some agreement and some conciliation. But evangelical Zionists, they don't just tend to be, they almost always are to the far right of all politics. They're militaristic, they're incredibly homophobic, incredibly Islamophobic, right? Racist, whatever you want to say. And there are more evangelical Zionists in the world than Jewish Zionists. When I was at AIPAC as a teenager, they would have, a huge amount of time in the conferences would be devoted to the Christian movement. And the irony of it is that the Christian evangelical movement doesn't actually want the Jews in Israel. They believe that Christ's return will necessitate the demise of all other religions. All others will convert to Christ or accept defeat. So Israel for them is like a proxy. They don't really support Jewish sovereignty. Their interest isn't Jewish healing from the Holocaust. Their interest is this, paternalistic, kind of loopy, kind of weird, vision of Christ's return. So we can get into this for a much longer time, but it's just important to know that this is a very tilted conflict, not just because of the efforts of Europe, back in the day, which, by the way, the way it's framed is that Israel was, people were fleeing the Holocaust and Europe supported that. That's not actually true. Israel was conceived far before the Holocaust. The British, who were the biggest sponsors of a Jewish state, actually just wanted the Jews out of Britain. There's all these records and letters between parliamentarians saying, we just want the Jews out of here. And they first thought of sending them to Uganda, to Argentina. The fact being is that it wasn't Israel. It was the Jews who wanted Israel, because that was, their Jews had been maintaining a presence there for thousands of years. Even during times of largely absence, there were Jews in all four holy cities. But the point is, from Europe to today, far greater European or Western imperial countries have staked their claim in the Middle East and are driving people apart, and conflict feeds pockets. Conflict keeps people in positions of power. It's really, really sad. That's where I am today. I think it's important that to acknowledge that there are truths. I think it's important to acknowledge that one side's suffering, one side's trauma doesn't have to exclude the other's trauma. They can coexist. Unfortunately, trauma can coexist, but it does. And Jews have a right to safety, but it should never come at the expense of, not just the health and well-being of Palestinian people, but their lives. And ethnic cleansing, genocide, the fact that those things are on the table 70 years after half the world's Jews were killed in just a few years is just, that says everything. And I think as far as solutions are concerned, that might seem like a pipe dream, but there's talk in the international community of establishing an international zone over that land, and basically sovereignty and political power be left in the hands of an international body. It's highly unlikely to happen. I think my hunch is that Israel is going to double down as it has been, and people are just going to step back from this in a few weeks or a few months, and there'll just be another conflict and down the road. And last thing I'll say is, like, I wrote my senior thesis in college on the gulf between Israelism, Israeli nationalism, and Jewish people. And any expert I interviewed and spoke with and have worked with over the years had always said that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets a lot better. And I hate to say that that's probably true. My best friend, he's a religious Jew. He's anti-Israeli imperialism. He was beaten by Israeli police the other day. He wasn't even protesting the violence against Palestinians. He was just protesting for Israel to not abandon the captives that Hamas has. He was at a protest arguing for a nonviolent strategy to guarantee the return of the abducted. Not to say that he wasn't arguing for Israel to not respond to Palestinians. He was saying, please don't treat these hundreds of people as disposable pawns. And when a religious Jew living in Jerusalem is beat by Israeli police for asking for his own countrymen or people to, right? I mean, that shows the state of affairs. So I could go on and on. I don't want to go on and on, but I have about 10, 15 minutes now, if need be, but I didn't cover everything, but I try to cover some of it.
Yeah. Well, just a final question, Dov, because I think your friend getting beaten up is symptomatic of the major issue that's really at play between the Zionist Israeli US, I would say, war machine. And as I indicated at the beginning, the State Department has sent out a memo to all US diplomats: do not talk about a ceasefire, do not talk about de-escalation, do not talk about an end to violence. We are here to support whatever it is that Israel's now going to do against Gaza. What is striking to me is that the rest of the world, outside North America and Europe and Israel, which is kind of all consenting around escalating the violence and eliminating the Gazan population, the rest of the world is uniting around the Resolution 242 of the United Nations, crafted after the June 6th war in 1967, where they said that the only real solution is a two-state, where the Jews get Israel, and the Palestinians get Palestine. And I think that what this calls up is what I experienced when I was at the University of Tel Aviv in 1972, 1973, for my junior year abroad. I was in the American program at the university there. And in one of the classes on, I think it was on modern Jewish history or something, the professor put a big map on the wall. And he said, this is Eretz Israel. This is the land that God gave us in the Bible, that included all of Israel, all of Jordan, all of the Golan Heights, and Sinai, and we're not going to stop till we get all of it. And he was very clear to us little, 19-year-old kids, really, that the policy was of a prolonged ethnic cleansing until the Jews had pushed out as many of the Palestinians as absolutely possible to reclaim the land that God had given us. And I remember just sitting there kind of shocked at the clarity and the unambiguity of that statement, and the support that virtually every one of the students indicated in a response. And so I think when we understand what Israel is really doing in forcing 1.1 million people out of northern Gaza, flattening it, it's very clear that they're going to move in now and basically level it, and then eventually bring in the settlers until they can force Egypt to the south, which has been resisting receiving the refugees because they know perfectly well what the Israeli long-term strategy is, to force Egypt to receive the rest of the refugees. And then, of course, then it all becomes part of Israel, because then the settlers come in and the waters turn back on and so forth and so on. So I think part of the excruciating reality of the moment that we face is we're coming to a kind of a conclusion of a 75-year-old policy initiated by Israel before 1947, which created the Palestinian enclave in Gaza, because they were all the ones that were pushed out of the initial nation state. So that's the contradiction. So you got Resolution 242, you got the Eretz Israel, and now it's being all focused on Gaza as sort of a penultimate battle between those two. I would say perspectives based on a principled position. One, you need to share the land and have equal sovereignty and dignity. And the other, Israel gets all of it.
Right.
Now, how would you respond or comment on that? Because I think that's the anvil.
Yeah. I mean, I'm hoping that these plans are more threats than anything. But there's no denying that the current leadership of Israel, the Israeli state, has. I mean, they annexed the West Bank over the summer. I mean, it's going to be a process of actually taking complete control over the West Bank. But they've had more or less complete control over the West Bank since the early 2000s. Yeah, that's the scary part, is that, while there are still liberal Zionists, there are Jews supportive of Israel who may not call themselves Zionists. While there are certainly people in this conversation who don't support ethnic cleansing, who don't believe, even if maybe spiritually, religiously, that the Jews ought to be, in control of all that land. Those mindsets and viewpoints have been pushed aside by the current leadership, which, to be clear, Netanyahu has been in power off and on for almost 30 years now, maybe more. I think from the early 90s till today. I think he missed one term. He was indicted on all these conspiracy charges, and he had a law passed that said a sitting prime minister can't be brought up on an indictment until after he's out of office, and he's still in office. So it's. I believe that is the plan of a large wing of the Israeli state, is to not just push Palestinians to the brink, but to wipe them out, and whether that means dispossessing, displacing, removing them, or killing them in large amounts at a time. Yeah, I understand that that's part of at least some of the political representation's plan, for sure. There are left-wing Jews. The irony of that festival is that most people attending that festival were left-wing Jews. They might be Zionists, but they're left-wing. They don't want to extinguish and exterminate Palestinian people, but the leadership right now is not just right-wing. I mean, it's hell-bent on perpetuating Palestinian subjugation, because it's its strength. I mean, I hate to say it, that's the way it keeps the train on track, is having a constant source of. This is not a conspiracy. I'm not saying that the Israelis like having Palestinian resistance, but what I was trying to explain earlier is that
exactly
work in the interest of militaristic leadership to constantly have violent resistance to respond to. And I think you're right, Jim. I mean, I think that's what we're looking towards right now is hell on earth over there. It already is hell on earth, but it's going to reach a new level of hell. And I mean, I can't be silent, but I also don't know what my words even do.
Yeah.
And just a comment too, like there were, still are lots of perspectives on Zionism. I mean, before the state was founded, there were Jews calling actively who were Zionists, but who believe that we need to live, if we're going to be in Palestine, we need to live in peace and harmony and collaboration with our Palestinian neighbors. And, I have Palestinian friends who've always said, before 48, Jews were Palestinians. The Jews who lived in Palestine were called Palestinians. We mainly think of Palestinians today as Muslim, but there are a lot of Christians. A lot of Christians left Palestine after 48. But before 48, Jews were Palestinian.
Exactly.
And the perspectives before 48 that were arguing for not just peace, but community with the Palestinian people that Jews had been allied with for so long. And to remind everybody, it was Christian Europe that was the thorn in the side of Jews and the Jewish people for so long. The Muslim world, for the most part, before Zionism, was largely supportive. There were obviously problems. There was racism and xenophobia, sure, but as an official policy, the Muslim world was tended to be an ally to the Jews from Europe than the other way around. But after 48, that changed, and the mindsets that had been advocating for a peaceful way forward were marginalized, and they continue to be marginalized. It's in Israel today, and when I was spending time there, there's no group of people that the Israeli government hates more, hates as much, maybe a bit less, than Palestinian resistance people, right? They can't stand their own subverters. They can't stand people who refuse to join the army. They can't stand the left-wing peace movement. There are groups in Israel that have devoted themselves. There's a group called Breaking the Silence, soldiers who, after their time in service, came forth and said, this is what I had to do. This is what I have to do as a member of the Israeli state, as a Jewish person. I have to displace these people. I need to hit children, right? Whatever the accusations were. But the point is that Israel can't stand when its own people break the silence, right? And I think what we're seeing today is Jewish community around the world, that includes me and friends of mine, who consciously don't want to not just live in Israel, but don't want to support Israel, because we see that Israel isn't just causing hell and misery for millions of Palestinians, but it's actively manipulating and exploiting collective Jewish history and trauma for its own militaristic settler gains. And there's a saying, like, not in my name, and I won't allow Israel to perpetuate itself in my name. It doesn't speak for me. Even if I have family there, even if I have family that agree with Israeli policy, I'll say loud and clear that, and I started this talk with everyone by saying this, is that there are truths in this conflict, there are facts in this conflict, and one of those is that Israel is wrong. It's not wrong to defend itself. It's not making up its connection to the land of Israel, but it's wrong to believe that ethnic cleansing, excruciatingly suffocating settler policy, military rule is the right, is moral, it's justified. It's wrong. There's no way around it. And the world is acknowledging that right now. And that's that. I mean, again, I just want to, just as an important clarification, I've mentioned it, but I'm not trying to deny the Jewish relationship with that land. It's our language. You speak Hebrew. It's from that land. If you know anything about the Torah, you practice Jewish law and kosher, right? The rules around dietary practices. Everything we know as a Jewish people is rooted in that land. But at the same time, for 2,000 years, we've maintained and thrived, and often, not always, in Europe, obviously, we dealt with serious anti-Semitism, but we've managed to exist in exile, in diaspora, and still maintain a connection to that land. And the danger is blaming the expulsion and exile by the Romans in the early 2000s, around Christ's death, as just the Palestinians all over again. The Romans are not the Palestinians again. The Palestinians are not responsible for the Jewish exile from Palestine thousands of years ago. But that's all the Palestinians are seen as, is just another obstacle in the way. And so it's a very complicated thing. It's not going to resolve itself overnight. It's not going to resolve itself in the next month or two or years from now, most likely. But, if more and more people can speak up that prior felt they couldn't, that's a victory in its own right. But again, the real victory is going to start with the end of violence. And I'm tired of people saying, like, violence against civilians, violence of all kinds. I don't think, obviously, in the rules of war that the international community has established, right, killing civilians is worse than killing soldiers. But why are we killing soldiers? Why is that okay? Why is it okay to even kill Palestinian resistance people, even if they're using terrible tactics too? There shouldn't be a need for this. There shouldn't be a need for bombings and shootings and stabbings. It's miserable. So that's where I'm at. I hate to say I'm not hopeful. But I guess the hope I have is seeing my own people, Jews, unify. I mean, there's a lot of us that are not unifying, but there's a strong community of Jews that are saying enough. And that's enough for me, from where I come from, to see people that maybe at one point couldn't speak out, but now see that they have no choice but to speak out.
Dov, thank you. This has been very illuminating. I want to respect and acknowledge the integrity with which you've lived your life, and your willingness to seek truth under duress, even at a young age. and for your willingness to go over to that land and live among the Israelis, but also the Palestinians, and continue to speak truth to power as you've seen it. It's a remarkable testament to your character that you have not succumbed to the propaganda, but you have had the integrity to create your own worldview. And we really appreciate the fact that you've spent time with us. I hope maybe we can have you back down the trail as events unfold. You need a commentator. But Dov Korff-Korn, everyone. Young man who's the attorney for the Romero Institute Lakota People's Law Project, of which I'm now a member.
Thanks,
so
Jim.
You,
Thanks, Jim. If I could say one thing just about,
sure.
Certainly have me on. I think if you have me on again, I'd prefer to talk about Indigenous issues on this continent, because that's what I work in. But Gaza, I'm happy to talk about Palestine. What I will say is people use the word Indigenous constantly in this conversation. They say Palestinians are Indigenous, Jews are settlers who have made up their connection. That's false, right? That Jews have not made up their connection. And the other part that is important to acknowledge is that indigeneity looks very different where you go. And on this continent, Turtle Island, North America, South America, indigeneity is particular. It's an obvious fact that before European contact, there were indigenous peoples here, and they've maintained their relationship with their land, their cultures, despite European contact and all the violence that followed. The thing about the Middle East and Palestine specifically is that peoples have been warring and traveling through it, and it's been controlled by different units over time. So indigeneity looks different.
Exactly.
Different term. The way my Hawaiian friends, my native Hawaiian friends, they understand that they came to Hawaii 15, 1600, maybe 2000 years ago. They say 46 generations. Hawaiians acknowledge that they came from somewhere else. But for all intents and purposes, they're now indigenous to Hawaii because ever since European contact, there were no other people in Hawaii besides Hawaiians. So it's important. How I see it is, like, if we're concerned so much about this issue, we also need to be concerned about where we live today. And I feel most people in this Zoom room right now live in the US, and there's so much we can do to support the violence that had gone on here and it continues to go on in some places, but supporting your local indigenous tribal nonprofits, environmental justice nonprofits. There's a lot of work we can do here to change the tone and the paradigm on this continent. But as I say, everything's linked. Oppression is linked, and we all learn lessons from other places, and we have some responsibility to, especially given how involved America is right now in Gaza and Israel. We have to hold our own country accountable, because this is where we pay our taxes, is where we hold our passports. So
absolutely.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, my friend.
Yeah.
Good luck with it all, and we'll see you soon.
Sounds good.
That'll bring us to a close for today, everyone. You're welcome to the after session chat, and then we'll see you all again here tomorrow for our next session of Humanity Rising, where we're actually going to be talking with a woman who's on the front lines of supporting Indigenous women in their struggle for climate justice. We'll be talking with Osprey Oriole Lake, who's the executive director of the Women's Earth Climate Action Network. That's tomorrow here on Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone.